At night, the world feels different. The noise withdraws. The certainty softens. And systems that appear solid during the day begin to reveal their seams. Tonight's story is not about something arriving from the sky. It is about something quietly happening on the ground, in rooms without windows, in language never meant for headlines, in preparations that only make sense if someone believes the future may not belong entirely to us. This is not a story about panic. It is a story about anticipation. Tonight, we begin with Chapter 1. When Markets Stopped Laughing. For most of modern history, the financial system treated the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence as irrelevant, not false, not disproven, simply irrelevant. Markets care about probability, not possibility. They care about repetition, precedent, and patterns that can be measured. Aliens had none of these. They belonged to speculation, entertainment, and fringe belief, not to balance sheets, and for a very long time that separation held. But sometime in the late 20th century, something subtle began to change, not in public, not in culture, but in language. Words like impossible began disappearing from internal assessments. So did never. They were replaced with phrases that sounded harmless, even academic. Low probability, high impact events, unknown external variables, non-state, non-human actors. None of these terms referenced extraterrestrial intelligence directly. They didn't need to, because in institutional environments, language doesn't change unless reality pressures it to. Markets did not suddenly believe in aliens. What they began to believe in was uncertainty of scale. And scale is everything. A hurricane can be priced. A war can be modeled. A pandemic can be stress-tested. But an intelligence that does not participate in human systems does not obey human incentives. It does not respond to sanctions. It does not negotiate through markets. It does not care about quarterly earnings. And that alone is destabilizing, because the global financial system is not just an economic engine. It is a psychological agreement. It assumes humanity is the highest decision-making authority on Earth. Once that assumption weakens, even slightly, the models begin to strain, not collapse, strain. And strain is the earliest warning sign. It is late now. The markets are closed. Numbers rest where they landed. But somewhere, in offices that never truly sleep, risk managers run scenarios that will never be published. Scenarios that are not labeled alien, but are quietly filed under something more acceptable. Unprecedented uncertainty. The first crack. The first crack did not appear during a UFO sighting. It appeared during a contradiction. Radar data that did not match known physics. Flight characteristics that ignored inertia. Objects that appeared, disappeared, and reappeared without signatures that could be categorized. At first, these anomalies stayed within defense systems. Military analysts flagged them. Scientists debated them. But what changed everything was when patterns emerged. Not one incident, not two, but clusters, repeated behaviors, consistent impossibilities, and patterns are what markets respond to, because patterns imply persistence, persistence implies presence, and presence implies long-term consequence. Once persistence entered the conversation, financial systems could no longer dismiss the phenomenon as noise. They didn't call it alien, they called it structural uncertainty. Why structure matters. Structure is the skeleton of forecasting. If something repeats, it can be priced. If it persists, it can be planned for. But what if the structure itself is unknown? What if the repeating behavior suggests a technology gap so wide that response becomes symbolic? This is where finance and defense quietly intersect. Defense asks, can we stop it? Finance asks, what happens if we can't? Those questions do not get answered on television. They get answered through contingency planning, through silent stress tests, through documents that explore what happens when public trust encounters information it was never prepared to integrate. And that is where disclosure enters the financial conversation, not as proof, but as risk. Of course, skeptics remain. Many anomalies can be misidentified. Sensor glitches exist. Human error is constant. And institutions know this. That is why they avoid certainty. They do not say this is extraterrestrial. They say, we cannot rule out external intelligence. That phrasing is intentional. It preserves flexibility. It delays panic. And it keeps the conversation alive without forcing conclusions. Markets thrive on delay. Delay allows adjustment. The moment finance acknowledged that some unknowns may not be human in origin was the moment the old assumption began to erode. Not publicly, internally, and internal shifts always precede public ones. Because by the time the public notices something, institutions have already been living with it for years. But acknowledging uncertainty is not the same as preparing for its consequences. Preparation comes later, and when it does, it leaves traces. Chapter 2. The risk that could not be insured. Insurance exists to make fear manageable. If something can be insured, it can be survived. Fires burn, but policies remain. Cities flood, but reconstruction follows. Insurance is the promise that no event is absolute. But there is a category of risk that insurers quietly avoid, not because it is impossible, but because it has no ceiling. Non-human intelligence is one of those risks, not because of hostility, but because of asymmetry. Insurance relies on comparability. How often has this happened before? How severe was the damage? How quickly did recovery occur? Alien intelligence has no data set, no precedent, no upper bound. You cannot price what you cannot bracket. And so, quietly, exclusions began appearing, not labeled, not obvious, but embedded, acts of war, acts of God, unforeseen external agents, language that creates distance, because distance preserves solvency. Imagine a world where something happens that cannot be insured, not because it destroys everything, but because it changes how people understand safety. That is the kind of event that makes markets hesitate. Uninsurable reality. Once a risk is deemed uninsurable, it becomes something else. It becomes existential. You don't recover from existential events. You adapt to them. And adaptation is slow, cultural, psychological. Markets can't rush it. They can only prepare quietly. That preparation looks like liquidity buffers, crisis communication planning, psychological impact studies, trust preservation strategies. None of these mention aliens. They don't have to. They are designed for moments when reality outruns explanation. Why trust matters more than currency. Currencies survive inflation. They do not survive disbelief. If people stop believing that institutions understand the world they govern, money becomes symbolic, still usable, still circulating, but weaker, hollowed, and hollow systems fail not with noise, but with drift. That is the nightmare scenario planners fear, not collapse, but erosion. Some argue that disclosure would be absorbed, that society has already been primed, that nothing would change. This may be partially true, But markets do not plan for best-case scenarios. They plan for loss of confidence. And confidence is fragile. The fact that this risk entered insurance language at all suggests something profound. Someone, somewhere, believed the future might not resemble the past, enough to plan for it. In the next section, we will move beyond insurance and into something even more sensitive: scarcity. Because once scarcity is questioned, everything else follows. Chapter 3: The Moment. Scarcity became a question. There are very few ideas more powerful than scarcity. Scarcity explains why people work, why nations compete, why wars are fought quietly and loudly. Scarcity is the invisible engine behind markets. Everything has value because something else is limited: land, energy, time, labor. For centuries, scarcity felt natural, almost biological. Food required soil, energy required fire, movement required muscle, then fuel. The entire economic world was built on these constraints. But the moment non-human intelligence entered serious discussion, even quietly, scarcity stopped feeling inevitable, not eliminated, questioned. And questioning scarcity is enough to destabilize systems that depend on acceptance. It is still night. Outside, cities glow quietly, consuming power without thinking about where it comes from. Scarcity works best when it is invisible, the idea that changes everything. Alien disclosure does not need to provide technology to disrupt markets. It only needs to introduce the idea that advanced technology may already exist. Because once people believe that energy could be abundant, movement effortless, materials nearly limitless, they begin to reevaluate prices. Why is energy expensive if better systems might exist? Why is labor exhausting if intelligence beyond ours solved it? Why is survival competitive if abundance is technically possible? These questions do not require answers. They only require belief. And belief spreads faster than proof. Scarcity as a social agreement. Scarcity is partly physical, but it is also political. Energy scarcity persists not only because of limits, but because of infrastructure, ownership, and control. When the public begins to suspect that those limits might not be absolute, trust erodes. Slowly, people don't revolt. They hesitate. They question. They stop accepting explanations that once felt reasonable. Markets notice hesitation. Hesitation appears as reduced spending, delayed investment, defensive saving. Nothing collapses, but momentum weakens. Skeptics argue that speculation about alien technology is irrelevant without evidence, and they are correct, technically, but markets do not operate on technical truth. They operate on perceived future potential. If enough people believe that current systems may be obsolete, those systems lose authority before replacements exist. That gap is dangerous. The threat is not alien technology. The threat is the idea that humanity may have been operating under artificial limits. Once that idea spreads, pricing becomes unstable, not because things change, but because belief changes first. And when belief shifts, the first institution to feel it is the one that manages trust. Chapter 4. When trust left the room, banks do not collapse when money disappears. They collapse when trust does. Trust is what allows people to leave their wealth somewhere else, to believe it will still be there tomorrow. Alien disclosure introduces a new kind of doubt, not about interest rates, not about regulation, but about whether the system understands reality. The doors are locked, the screens glow softly, numbers move without emotion, But trust is not visible on a screen. It is felt. Institutional confidence. Shock. If governments admit they do not fully understand who or what shares our environment, then institutional authority weakens. Not catastrophically, subtly. People begin asking new questions. If they didn't know this, what else don't they know? If they knew and didn't tell us, what else was curated? These questions don't require conspiracy. They require honesty. And honesty destabilizes managed systems. Why markets fear unknown intelligence? Markets can adapt to known enemies. They can price hostile nations. They can hedge against war. Unknown intelligence introduces uncertainty without intent. Intent is critical. Without intent, deterrence fails. Without deterrence, planning becomes symbolic. Finance is allergic to symbolism. It needs mechanisms. Some argue that disclosure would strengthen trust, that transparency builds confidence. In the long term, perhaps, but in the short term, transparency reveals limits. And limits weaken authority before they rebuild it. Markets react to the short term. Disclosure does not remove control. It reveals that control was never absolute, and revelation destabilizes systems built on confidence. The next shock is quieter still. It doesn't involve money at all. It involves meaning. Chapter 5. The Psychological Run. When people imagine panic, they imagine chaos, crowds, noise. But the most dangerous panic is silent. A psychological run. It is late. Phones are dim. Thoughts drift. This is when belief changes. Withdrawal without movement. People do not immediately withdraw money. They withdraw faith. They stop trusting narratives. They seek alternative explanations. Some turn inward, some outward, some upward. Religion resurges, myth returns, conspiracy flourishes, not because people are foolish, but because meaning is destabilized. Markets cannot price meaning loss, meaning as economic glue. Money works because it represents future effort. If the future feels uncertain at a civilizational level, effort loses direction. People don't stop working. They stop believing work leads somewhere stable. This creates economic drag, invisible, persistent. Some argue humanity is resilient, that belief systems adapt. This is true, but adaptation is slow, and markets are impatient. The danger is not panic, it is drift. And drift is difficult to reverse, which is why disclosure, if it happens, will not happen all at once. Chapter 6. Why disclosure is being stretched. Truth revealed too quickly overwhelms. Institutions understand this. They also understand something else. Gradual truth preserves control. Years pass quietly. Language changes. Tone shifts. But nothing is announced. Conditioning the nervous system. Disclosure unfolds in phases: ridicule, ambiguity, normalization, acknowledgement. Each phase reduces shock. Each phase trains acceptance. This is not deception. It is management. Slow truth as stability tool. Sudden truth destabilizes identity. Slow truth allows integration. Markets depend on integration. Critics call this manipulation. Perhaps, but uncontrolled truth can destroy systems faster than lies. Institutions choose continuity. By the time disclosure feels official, it will feel familiar. That is the goal. In the next part, we move into territory rarely discussed publicly, where disclosure planning becomes philosophical, and where the question is no longer if humanity is alone, but what it means if we are not. Chapter 7. When humanity stopped being the center. There is a belief so deeply embedded in modern life that most people never recognize it as a belief at all. That humanity sits at the center of meaning, not just biologically, but philosophically, economically, morally. Markets assume this without ever stating it. Human labor creates value. Human desire creates demand. Human innovation defines progress. Every model begins there, but the moment non-human intelligence is treated as a serious possibility, not myth, not fiction, not metaphor, that assumption weakens, not collapses, weakens, and weakening is enough. It is quiet now, the kind of quiet where thoughts stretch out and old certainties feel less solid. This is where the shift begins, the end of human exceptionalism. For centuries, humanity defined itself by what it believed nothing else possessed: language, reason, technology, agency. Each time one of these traits was challenged, the response was defensive. But alien disclosure challenges all of them at once. If intelligence exists that surpasses ours, not spiritually, but materially, then humanity is no longer exceptional. It becomes situated, one intelligence among others. That realization does not cause panic, it causes humility, and humility is destabilizing to systems built on dominance. Why markets care about identity? Markets are not neutral. They reflect assumptions about hierarchy: who produces, who consumes, who leads, who follows. Human exceptionalism justifies exploitation of resources, of labor, of environments. If humanity is no longer the apex intelligence, then the moral narrative supporting these systems fractures, not overnight. Gradually, people begin asking different questions, not how much can we extract, but why are we doing this at all? Those questions are expensive. Some argue alien intelligence would not affect identity, that humanity would remain focused on itself. This may be true for many, but identity does not need to shift universally to destabilize markets. It only needs to shift among enough people to change behavior. Markets respond to minorities long before majorities. Disclosure threatens not economies directly, but the story economies tell about themselves. And stories, once questioned, do not easily regain authority. When identity shifts, institutions scramble to preserve coherence, and the first institution to feel that strain is religion. Chapter 8: The Silent Religious Contingency. Religion is often framed as separate from economics. It is not. Religion stabilizes meaning, meaning stabilizes behavior, behavior stabilizes markets. Alien disclosure touches religion more delicately than politics, which is why institutions treat it cautiously. Churches stand empty at night, mosques rest, temples are still, belief sleeps, but it does not disappear. Faith and non-human intelligence. Most major religions were formed under the assumption that humanity occupies a special place in creation, not necessarily alone, but chosen. Alien disclosure does not automatically contradict faith, but it forces reinterpretation, and reinterpretation takes time. During that time, uncertainty grows. Uncertainty affects behavior. Behavior affects economies. Quiet interfaith conversations. There have been no official announcements, no declarations, but interfaith dialogues quietly expanded their scope. Theological papers explored non-human intelligence decades before public discussion allowed it, not because of proof, but because institutions plan for meaning shocks. Religion does not fear aliens. It fears disorientation, and disorientation spreads economically. Some faith traditions already allow for non-human beings, angels, spirits, jinn. For these systems, disclosure may integrate smoothly. Others will struggle. Markets respond to struggle faster than belief. The more belief systems must adapt, the more transitional instability appears, not violent, confused, Confusion is expensive. If belief must be managed carefully, so must information. And that brings us to media. Chapter 9. Why media does not break the story. Many people assume that if disclosure were imminent, media would be racing toward it. This misunderstands media's role. Media does not reveal reality. It stabilizes it. Screens glow, headlines scroll, but some stories never appear. Information as a containment tool. Media organizations depend on trust. Trust depends on continuity. Alien disclosure disrupts both, which is why media treatment of UFOs and UAPs shifted slowly from ridicule to curiosity to seriousness to repetition. Repetition normalizes. Normalization reduces shock. Shock destabilizes markets. Why soft disclosure works. A single announcement causes chaos. 1,000 small acknowledgments cause fatigue. Fatigue reduces reaction. Media understands this instinctively. They do not suppress. They dilute. Some accuse media of complicity, perhaps, but complicity assumes intent. Often, it is instinct. Systems preserve themselves. Disclosure is not hidden. It is stretched, thin enough to absorb, but there is a place where stretching truth becomes impossible. Science. Chapter 10. The limits of scientific comfort. Science thrives on uncertainty, but only within bounds. Alien intelligence pushes those bounds outward. Uncomfortably, labs are quiet at night. Data waits. Science and the unanswerable question. Science requires testability, repeatability. Disclosure introduces phenomena that appear intelligent but refuse interaction. This frustrates method, and when method fails, science becomes cautious. Caution slows consensus. Without consensus, markets hesitate. Why absence is harder than evidence. Evidence can be debated. Absence cannot. If something exists but does not engage, it remains outside explanation. That liminal state destabilizes planning. Some scientists dismiss the issue entirely. Others quietly reframe questions. Both responses signal uncertainty. Markets read signals. The longer something resists explanation, the more power it gains psychologically. And psychology is where the deepest preparation occurs. Chapter 11. The quiet psychological preparation. The human nervous system was not built for cosmic uncertainty. Institutions know this, which is why psychology became central to disclosure planning. Night deepens, thoughts slow. This is the state institutions aim for, preparing the mind, not the world. Disclosure is not an external event, it is an internal one. It occurs inside belief, inside identity, inside meaning. Psychological studies quietly explored how people respond to the idea of non-human intelligence, not contact, just existence. The findings were consistent. Gradual exposure reduces fear. Abrupt revelation amplifies it. Markets respond accordingly. Why fear is not the goal. Fear causes action. Action causes instability. Acceptance causes adjustment. Adjustment preserves systems. Some believe humanity deserves the truth immediately. Perhaps. But institutions are not moral agents. They are stabilizers. By the time disclosure feels undeniable, the mind will already be familiar with it. That is the intention. In the next part, we reach the most sensitive layer of all. Not belief, not markets, but power. Chapter 12. Power in a non-human world. Power has always relied on a simple assumption that humans are the highest authority capable of shaping outcomes on Earth. Governments enforce laws, armies enforce borders, markets enforce value. Even when systems compete, they compete within a shared belief that humanity controls the ceiling. Alien disclosure threatens that ceiling. not by force, by implication. The night feels wider now, not emptier, just larger, as if the walls of the world have moved slightly outward. Authority without supremacy. Authority depends on supremacy, not moral supremacy, functional supremacy. The belief that if something goes wrong, someone human can intervene. Alien intelligence disrupts this belief, not because it attacks, but because it exists beyond deterrence. You cannot sanction it, you cannot vote it out, you cannot embargo it. This creates a quiet power vacuum, not one that collapses states, but one that erodes certainty, and certainty is what power rests on. Why governments fear benign intelligence. Hostile threats unify populations. Benign unknowns confuse them. If non-human intelligence exists and does not interact, then what does authority mean? Who protects whom? Who explains reality? Governments are designed to manage conflict. They are not designed to manage irrelevance, and irrelevance is the unspoken fear. Some argue that governments would retain control regardless, that daily life would continue unchanged. This may be true at the surface, but legitimacy is not surface level. It operates beneath awareness. Once legitimacy is questioned, obedience becomes conditional. Markets feel conditional obedience immediately. Alien disclosure does not overthrow power, it relativizes it, and relative power is unstable. When authority becomes uncertain, hierarchy trembles, and hierarchy is the spine of markets. Chapter 13. Why hierarchy cannot survive cosmic humility. Markets assume hierarchy, developed and developing, producers and consumers, leaders and followers. Hierarchy simplifies complexity. It allows pricing. Alien disclosure complicates hierarchy because intelligence implies agency, and agency implies comparison. The city is asleep. Above it, the sky remains indifferent. This indifference is the problem. The collapse of the ladder. Human hierarchy assumes a ladder, more power at the top, less power below. Alien intelligence introduces an external reference point. Suddenly, the ladder is not the tallest structure. It becomes local, contextual, temporary. People do not panic over this. They internalize it, and internal shifts are slower, but far more dangerous to systems. Economic hierarchy and meaning. Why do people accept inequality? Because hierarchy is framed as progress. Upward movement is possible. Alien disclosure reframes progress. If humanity is not progressing toward supremacy, but merely existing within a larger system, then upward movement loses its narrative power. People still work, but they question why. That question drains energy from markets. Some claim hierarchy would persist regardless, that human systems are self-contained, perhaps, but belief in transcendence motivates sacrifice. Remove transcendence, and motivation becomes transactional. Transaction without meaning is fragile. The danger is not rebellion, it is disengagement, and disengagement is difficult to reverse, which brings us to the final mechanism of control. Law. Chapter 14. Law in a world that may not answer to it. Law is humanity's promise to itself, a declaration that behavior can be governed through agreement. Alien disclosure introduces an uncomfortable question. What if some actors do not answer to law at all? Courthouses sleep, statutes remain written, but the sky has no jurisdiction, jurisdiction without reach. Law functions through enforcement. Enforcement requires reach. Alien intelligence, if real, exists beyond human reach. This does not invalidate law, but it exposes its boundaries. Boundaries weaken absolutism, and absolutism is what gives law weight. Markets depend on legal absolutes. Contracts assume enforceability. Property assumes sovereignty. Currency assumes regulation. If the public begins to sense that ultimate control does not exist, then law feels provisional. Provisional law produces cautious behavior. Caution slows economies. Legal scholars argue law governs humans, not the universe. This is correct. But law also governs belief in order. And belief is fragile. Alien disclosure does not dissolve law. It contextualizes it. Contextual systems are psychologically weaker. At this point, preparation stops being abstract and becomes operational. Chapter 15. The quiet operational shifts. When institutions accept a possibility privately, their behavior changes, not visibly, procedurally. Documents move, meetings end without minutes, language softens. What preparation actually looks like. There are no public drills, no emergency broadcasts. Preparation looks like cross-agency communication, psychological continuity planning, narrative consistency strategies, economic shock absorption modeling. These are not alien plans. They are human reaction plans. Continuity over truth. Institutions value continuity more than truth, not because truth is dangerous, but because disruption is. Disclosure is managed to preserve continuity. Markets reward continuity. Critics call this deception. Institutions call it stewardship. Both can be true. Once continuity planning exists, disclosure is no longer hypothetical. It is scheduled, loosely, quietly. Which brings us to the final shift, acceptance. Chapter 16. When preparation becomes acceptance. There is a moment when preparation ends, not publicly, internally. The night feels familiar now, not threatening, just vast, living with the idea. Institutions eventually stop asking if. They begin asking when. That transition is invisible, but irreversible. Once acceptance sets in, behavior stabilizes around it. This is where we are now, not at revelation, at accommodation. Why nothing feels urgent. Urgency suggests panic. Calm suggests control. The absence of urgency does not mean absence of concern. It means concern has been integrated. Some believe nothing is happening. That silence means absence. History suggests otherwise. Silence often means digestion. By the time disclosure occurs, it will feel unsurprising. That is the design. In the next part, we move into the final territory, not markets, not power, but meaning. Chapter 17. What remains valuable when humanity is not alone. Value is not fixed, it is contextual. Gold is valuable because it is rare. Land is valuable because it is limited. Money is valuable because people agree it is. Alien disclosure does not erase value. It rearranges it. The night feels slower now. Thoughts no longer race. They settle. This is where valuation begins to change. The quiet repricing of meaning. If humanity is not alone, then value can no longer be measured only by dominance or extraction. What matters begins to shift, not suddenly, gradually. Creativity gains weight. Understanding gains weight. Continuity gains weight. Markets sense this before people articulate it. Cultural products outlast commodities. Knowledge outlasts infrastructure. Memory outlasts ownership. This is not collapse, it is reprioritization. Why markets follow meaning? Markets respond to where attention moves. If attention moves away from accumulation and toward comprehension, then capital follows. Education, archives, language, history, these become more valuable when identity is no longer singular. Some argue material needs will always dominate. They are correct. But meaning directs how those needs are met. Alien disclosure introduces humility. Humility reshapes demand. Value does not disappear, it becomes quieter. And when value shifts, memory becomes currency. Chapter 18. Memory as the last stable asset. Civilizations are remembered longer than they are obeyed. Memory is humanity's longest-lasting system. Ruins rest, records fade, but memory persists. Why memory survives disclosure? Alien disclosure does not rewrite history, it reframes it. Suddenly, human achievements are not final statements, they are contributions. Memory preserves contribution without demanding supremacy. Markets rarely price memory, but civilizations depend on it. Archives over empires. Empires fall. Archives endure. In a universe where humanity is not unique, what matters is what we leave behind, not territory, understanding. This is why institutions quietly invest in preservation, data, culture, records, not because of aliens, but because meaning may outlive power. Some dismiss this as abstract, but abstraction guides long-term behavior. Markets ignore it, civilizations cannot. Memory is the only asset that remains relevant across unknown futures, which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. Legacy. Chapter 19. Legacy without supremacy. Human legacy was once defined by dominance. Who conquered, who ruled, who controlled. Alien disclosure dissolves that framework. The sky does not remember empires, it observes. A new definition of legacy. If humanity is one intelligence among many, legacy becomes relational. How we behaved, how we treated our world, how we understood ourselves. Legacy shifts from conquest to coherence. Markets cannot price coherence, but civilizations require it. Why this frightens institutions? Institutions are built on permanence. Legacy without supremacy implies impermanence. Impermanence undermines authority, which is why this shift is resisted quietly. Some believe legacy concerns only philosophers. History disagrees. Every collapse began with a crisis of meaning. Alien disclosure does not erase humanity, it contextualizes it, and context forces reflection. Chapter 20. The question no model can answer. There is one question no institution has solved. Not governments, not markets, not religions. The night is nearly complete. The world rests. What is humanity for? If humanity is not alone, then survival is not the only goal. What are we for? Creation? Understanding? Witnessing? This question has no economic model, no risk assessment, no contingency plan. Why silence is the only honest response? Institutions prefer answers, but some questions require silence. Alien disclosure forces one such silence. Meaning cannot be imposed. It must be lived. Some will reject the question entirely. That is also a response. Markets will adapt either way. The absence of an answer is not failure, it is openness. And openness is the final preparation. Chapter 21. The last preparation. There is no final announcement, no singular moment. The night remains, unchanged, living without resolution. Disclosure does not arrive like a revelation. It arrives like familiarity. By the time it is spoken, it has already been lived. The preparation was never about aliens. It was about humanity learning to exist without certainty. Why markets are ready. Markets survive adaptation. They do not survive shock. Preparation ensures adaptation. That is why nothing feels dramatic. Drama is destabilizing. Some will feel betrayed, others relieved. Both reactions will fade. What remains is adjustment. The future does not belong to panic. It belongs to patience, which brings us to the end, not of the mystery, but of the telling. Final act, return to silence. There was no invasion, no declaration, no collapse, only a gradual understanding that the universe was always larger than we allowed ourselves to imagine. The markets adjusted, institutions adapted, humanity continued, the night remains quiet. The question remains unanswered, and perhaps it always was meant to be. Let the mystery rest. Chapter 22. Civilizations that outlived their certainty. Every civilization believes it understands the world it inhabits. Not completely, but sufficiently. Enough to build laws, enough to establish value, enough to decide what matters. History shows this confidence is temporary. The night feels ancient. Stars look unchanged, but everything beneath them has come and gone before. This perspective is uncomfortable and necessary. The pattern of expansion. Civilizations do not collapse when they discover new lands. They collapse when they discover new contexts. The moment the Earth was revealed not to be the center of the universe, religion adapted. The moment continents were connected, empires rebalanced. Alien disclosure represents a similar expansion, not of geography, of context. Humanity is not discovering a new place, it is discovering a new frame, context versus control. Control assumes boundaries, context dissolves them. When boundaries dissolve, systems designed for enclosure struggle. Markets assume enclosure. Nation-states assume enclosure. Identity assumes enclosure. Alien disclosure removes the illusion that Earth is a closed system. That realization does not destroy civilization, but it ends innocence. Some argue humanity already accepts cosmic insignificance. Philosophically, perhaps. Practically, no. Daily life still assumes dominance. Alien disclosure challenges that assumption operationally. Every civilization that survived its loss of certainty did so by changing what it valued, not by denying the change. Which brings us to time. Chapter 23. Time. Scales. Humans were never meant to feel. Human systems operate on short time frames. Elections, quarterly earnings, lifetimes. Alien intelligence implies timelines beyond these scales. And time scale changes everything. The clock is quiet, minutes stretch. This is where anxiety fades. Long intelligence, short humanity. If non-human intelligence exists, it may experience time differently. Longer planning horizons, slower urgency, patience beyond human politics. Markets are allergic to long time frames. They reward speed, but survival favors patience. This contradiction is central to preparation. Why long time changes value? When time horizons extend, short-term gain loses importance. Legacy matters more than profit. Stability matters more than growth. This is not how markets are built, but it is how civilizations endure. Some argue humanity will never adopt long-time thinking, but institutions already do, slowly, quietly. Alien disclosure introduces time humility, and humility alters priorities. Time reshapes memory. Chapter 24. Memory as a civilizational defense. Weapons deter force. Memory deters collapse. Libraries sleep. Archives wait. Why memory outlasts. Power civilizations that remembered themselves lasted longer than those that dominated others. Alien disclosure reframes humanity as a contributor to a larger narrative. Memory preserves contribution. Cultural immunity. Memory creates continuity. Continuity creates resilience. Resilience stabilizes systems even when identity shifts. Markets ignore memory. Civilizations rely on it. Some dismiss memory as symbolic. Symbols shape behavior. Behavior shapes economies. In an expanded universe, memory is insulation, which brings us to continuity. Chapter 25. Continuity without centrality. Continuity does not require supremacy. It requires coherence. The night holds together, even without certainty. Life after centrality. Humanity does not need to be central to continue. It needs to be coherent. Alien disclosure challenges centrality. It does not challenge continuity. This distinction matters. Markets as continuity machines. Markets exist to maintain continuity, not truth, not justice, continuity. Alien disclosure threatens continuity only if mishandled, which is why preparation focuses here. Some believe continuity equals stagnation. Continuity allows adaptation. The future does not require dominance. It requires coherence, which leaves one final question. Chapter 26. The Long View. What does humanity become when it stops measuring itself against the sky? The stars remain, unchanged, a civilization among others. Alien disclosure invites a different self-image, not ruler, not victim, participant. Participation reduces fear. Fear destabilizes systems. Participation stabilizes them. Why this is the end game. The goal was never to hide the truth forever. It was to prepare humanity to live with it. Markets were not preparing for aliens. They were preparing for acceptance. Some will never accept this framing. That is acceptable. Acceptance does not require unanimity. The universe does not demand our understanding, only our adjustment. We are nearing the end now, not of the mystery, but of the night-telling. Epilogue. The night after the story. There is a moment late at night when even questions grow tired. They stop demanding answers. They stop reaching outward. They simply remain. This is that moment. The world has not changed suddenly. No announcement echoed across the sky. No final truth arrived to settle everything. Cities still hum quietly. Markets still open and close. People still wake, work, rest, and wonder. And yet, something has shifted. Not in the headlines, not in the numbers, but in the background assumptions that once felt permanent. The night is wide again. Stars remain where they were long before any human system existed. They do not rush. They do not announce themselves. They simply persist. The aftermath, without an event. History often teaches us to expect transformation to be dramatic, a collapse, a revelation, a dividing line. But most real transformations are quieter. They happen without ceremony. Alien disclosure, if it is coming or if it has already arrived in fragments, does not behave like a moment. It behaves like an adjustment, a slow recalibration of perspective. People do not wake up afraid. They wake up curious, and curiosity is manageable. Fear destabilizes systems. Curiosity reshapes them. That is why nothing feels urgent. Urgency would signal panic. Calm signals integration. What the markets learned. The markets did not prepare for visitors. They prepared for belief change. They prepared for the moment when humanity's mental map of reality expanded beyond its borders, not because money matters more than truth, but because belief determines behavior, and behavior determines stability. The markets learned something simple, that reality does not need to be explained to be absorbed. It only needs time. What institutions accepted? Institutions eventually stop asking what if. They begin asking, how do we live with it? This is not surrender. It is maturity. Every system that endures learns to coexist with uncertainty. Alien disclosure does not remove control. It reveals that control was always partial, and partial control, once accepted, is less frightening than total illusion. What remains unchanged? Human life continues. People still love, still worry, still plan for tomorrow. Children are still born into a world that feels ordinary. That ordinariness is the point. If the universe is larger than humanity imagined, then humanity's task is not to dominate it. It is to remain human within it. Meaning was never guaranteed by isolation. It was always created through experience. There is one question that never needed an answer. Are we alone? Because even if we are not, the work of being human remains the same: to understand, to remember, to choose what matters. The universe does not ask for certainty, only awareness. Return to silence. The night does not explain itself. It never has. It only offers space for thought to slow and meaning to settle. The story ends here not because the mystery is solved, but because the listener no longer needs it to be. The desert is quiet now. The markets sleep. The sky remains, and the question rests.